So as we record this, which is the month of November in 2020, which people can infer, I guess, from our mustaches, um, we are living through probably the most disruptive and giant organization design experiment, right, known to modern history, where effectively organizations around the world have had to face this shock of working in a disrupted manner, in a distributed manner because of the pandemic. So this extreme pressure to not work co-located but work distributed, it's been completely unprecedented. We haven't seen anything like this before. Do you see any long-term impact of this on the way authority and hierarchy in particular will be constructed in organizations?
I think it's a very interesting question, and these predictions are always difficult, so I should be very careful when I make them. But maybe contrary to what one would expect, I'm not necessarily convinced that that huge natural experiment which we've all been thrown into would necessarily fuel the emergence of flat organizations. So let me maybe elaborate a little bit on why I don't think that this is the case. So I think the trend towards flat organizations, where at best competence-based authorities being used by team leaders, and possibly none, because the degree of decentralization may be even higher, has started prior to the pandemic, and it is being sort of driven by different effects, which we will probably still talk about later on. What I think is key in making such organizations work, such flat organizations work, is that you select the right people. And selection, I believe, is much more important than treatment in these particular instances, because you rely on people living up to norms that they will probably have learned over a longer period in their lives prior to that. So vanguard organizations that do well in flat are actually extremely good at selecting those people that will be willing to be accountable for their actions and appreciate the autonomy that they have in both task design and communication, and possibly even the discussion of rewards. So if I think of the pandemic, I'm thinking about this as a huge experiment in which all of a sudden all sorts of people are being thrown into the situation where distributed remote work with less visible influence by their bosses is required from them, and very often so, seemingly without formal guidance by these bosses. Now, and I think in line with the predictions that you and Julien in your paper have, if an informal organization is supposed to emerge without formal guidance, there is a good chance that this will go wrong. So my sense is that during the times of the pandemic, there have been a lot of attempts and expectations of organizations all of a sudden moving and transitioning to autonomous, team-based, remote, distributed, asynchronous work without necessarily the necessary guidance by managers, and that may have led to a lot of disappointment, which I believe could, as a matter of fact, even lead to a renaissance of more traditional types of work after the pandemic. Okay. Now, I understand that this goes against the predictions that people will have become accustomed to home office work, and that people will appreciate the reduction in emissions and the support of sort of climate change measures and so forth. All this may be the case. I guess what I want to throw in the mix is the argument that there may also be a very good counter tendency to these sort of flat organizations that is actually being caused by the pandemic.
That's very interesting. Yeah. So particularly those who have suffered the chaos that is created by the lack of structure, maybe even more resistant to adopting this permanently and want to go back as quickly as possible to a more structured system. Yeah.
Possibly so.
Yeah. Do you feel the same way about the rise of data and digitalization? Because one of the jokes, which I'm sure you were also familiar with, who was the most successful champion of digitalization in your company? That's the multiple choice question. And the options are the CEO, the CTO, the CIO, or COVID-19. And clearly it is COVID-19, right? So it has created this massive digitalization wave. So do you see that having any effect on hierarchies?
So I think if I think of digitalization more broadly, and particularly of the availability of data, and therefore, of course, the sort of the improvement of narrow AI, at least, I think there I have a distinctly different view, which I think probably more in line with yours on that one. So I guess the investment into AI has never been monotonic in the past. So I would not exclude that when impatient investor expectations aren't being met in the near future, we will see a decrease again in this investment, at least for some time. But in the long run, it's going to stay with us and it's going to be more powerful. And when it becomes more powerful, I believe the only natural response that I would expect from at least those people who have a chance is to qualify with complementary skills. And these complementary skills will bank on recombination of knowledge, aka creativity, because we know that that is the most difficult thing for AI to currently still mimic, and probably in the foreseeable future still to mimic. Now, again, we should digress here. I think when we're talking about creative people, we're not talking about the Leonardo da Vinci types, distant domain spanners. The few of us, I think, are capable of doing this, but we will be creating these, what I would call niche generalists. So specialists of a new type, in the sense that they will be recombining knowledge from adjacent domains, which leads to non-routine output. And that non-routine output, as we know, is very difficult to assess in traditional managerial organizations, or managerially led organizations, and leads to a lot of frustration, as per our discussion before, when you try to manage it within such a traditional organization. So the obvious tendency here for me is that people who will qualify along these dimensions will look for work in these non-traditional novel forms of organizing, flat organizations. And that trend is going to be moderated, positively moderated, by income inequality. The less money means something to you because money can only fulfill your consumption needs, but wealth creation is out of the question for many, at least those who receive salaries. The more important work satisfaction will become, and that work satisfaction you will more likely attain in organizations that give you a chance to do so. Now, I think this is a very complicated subject. As a matter of fact, it's a domain which I believe would benefit from a book project on how to organize better for flatter. And I'm toying with the idea of doing so, because of course there are loads of downsides as well. I mean, it would be naive to believe that these flat organizations are silver bullets for resolving the problems that we have had in coordinating creative staff in the past. But I think they're the point of departure, and then working around the obstacles and dealing with their downsides will be a very interesting venture.
Are there any particular ideas you might want to leave in the end of this discussion for, say, doctoral students or researchers beginning their careers? What are some interesting open questions in this space of hierarchies in organizations?
So I'm not sure if I, my age, am in the position to, sort of give somebody great advice. But I think, as per what we were discussing before, taking seriously the notion that novel forms of organizing came to stay, and that they will extend beyond the scope of those who in the past have already voluntarily selected into them. But that they will become means which will in part be designed by managers who want to attract staff. So, organizations that need designs for proper selection, organizations that need to think more about the little stuff that one can do in terms of treatment in order to, foster those employees who select into them and treat them ideally. I think that is something which is tangible enough for a doctoral thesis, in the sense that you can reach some conclusions over the course of 3 to 4 years, and yet probably still under-examined enough to make a contribution.
Thank you, Markus. That was very helpful, and I'm glad you could take the time to join us.
No, it's been a pleasure. Thanks, Panish.